A billionaire CEO does not knock on a poor man's door in the rain unless her whole world is already breaking. The storm rolled down the Vermont hills like a living thing, rattling the windows of Daniel Mercer's small wooden house and turning the gravel road outside into a silver ribbon of mud and water. Inside, the lights were warm, the wood stove crackled softly, and his 9-year-old daughter, Ellie, slept curled beneath a quilt on the old sofa with a half-finished storybook resting against her chest. Daniel had just finished patching a leak above the back porch, his flannel shirt still damp at the shoulders, his work boots leaving faint marks near the door. He was a man built by long days, quiet promises, and the kind of responsibility that did not ask for applause. Then came the knock. Not gentle, not casual. 3 sharp knocks against the front door, cutting through the sound of rain and wind. Daniel froze, hammer still in hand. Nobody came this far up the mountain after dark unless they were lost, desperate, or both. He crossed the room carefully, glanced once at Ellie to make sure she was still asleep, and opened the door. Madeline Whitmore stood on his porch beneath the yellow porch light, soaked from the storm, her expensive black coat clinging heavily to her shoulders, her chestnut hair darkened by rain, her face pale but determined. Daniel recognized her immediately. Everyone in the county did. She was the 36-year-old CEO of Whitmore Estates Group, the woman on magazine covers, the woman who bought historic hotels, ski lodges, and half the lakefront properties people used to think belonged to ordinary families forever. She looked like someone who had never needed to ask twice for anything. But tonight, standing in front of his weathered door, she looked like someone who had run out of rooms where power still worked. "Mr. Mercer?" she asked. "Yes. I need to speak with you." Daniel looked past her toward the dark road. No security car, no assistant, no driver waiting with an umbrella. Just her, the storm, and a silver sedan parked crookedly near his mailbox. "You are a long way from town," he said. "I know. Are you hurt?" No, rainwater dripped from the edge of her sleeve onto the porch boards. Her voice stayed controlled, but her hands betrayed her, trembling slightly as she tightened them around a leather folder pressed to her chest. Daniel stepped back. "Come inside before you catch your death out there." She hesitated, as if crossing that threshold cost her more pride than she expected. Then she entered. The scent of rain, cold air, and expensive perfume moved into the little house with her. Daniel closed the door, lowered his voice, and pointed toward Ellie sleeping on the sofa. "My daughter is asleep. Whatever this is, keep it quiet." Madeline looked at the child, and something softened in her expression for half a second before the mask returned. Daniel handed her a towel from the chair by the stove. She accepted it with stiff politeness, but did not use it right away. "I do not have much time," she said. "Most people do not when they come knocking in a storm." Her eyes lifted to his. "I need a husband by Friday." Daniel stared at her. The fire popped softly in the stove. Rain whispered down the windows like 100 unanswered questions. He waited for a laugh, for an explanation, for any sign that the most powerful woman in town had not just walked into his house asking for the one thing he had buried with his wife years ago. None came. Madeline Whitmore stood in the warm light of his living room, proud, drenched, and terrified beneath her expensive silence. And Daniel Mercer understood that whatever had brought her to his door was not romance. It was survival. Madeline Whitmore opened the leather folder with fingers that had signed hotel acquisitions, resort contracts, and board resolutions worth more than Daniel Mercer's entire mountain road. But inside his small living room, beneath the low glow of a lamp and the steady hush of rain, that folder looked strangely out of place. Daniel stood near the wood stove, arms relaxed at his sides, watching her without rushing her, without kneeling to her panic, without showing even a flicker of interest in the power she carried everywhere else. 6 months, she said, placing several pages on the kitchen table. A legal arrangement. Clean. Private. Fully compensated. Daniel glanced at the papers, but did not touch them. "You came here in a storm to offer me a business deal about marriage. It is not romantic." "Good. Neither was the way you said it." Her jaw tightened. "I need stability on paper before Friday morning. My father's estate terms are being challenged. If the board proves I am isolated, they can remove me from control and hand voting authority to my cousin. And I am your answer? You are unmarried. You have no scandals. You own property. You have a reputation for honesty." Daniel let the words settle. The fire snapped once inside the stove. Ellie shifted beneath her quilt, but did not wake. Madeline reached into the folder and pulled out a cashier's check. She placed it on top of the contract with careful precision. The number was large enough to repair the roof, pay off the truck, replace the furnace, and keep Ellie's college funds safe for years. Daniel looked at it for one quiet second. Then he looked at his sleeping daughter. "Take that back," he said. Madeline blinked. "You have not even read the amount." "I saw enough. Mr. Mercer, this could change your life. Not all change is worth bringing through the front door." She stared at him as if no one had ever spoken to her that way without fear. "I am not trying to insult you. You are trying to rent my name. I am trying to survive." "Then say that." The room went still. Rainwater slid down the window glass in uneven lines, blurring the darkness outside. Madeline's face changed, not dramatically, not enough for someone in a boardroom to notice, but enough for Daniel. Her pride trembled before her voice did. "If I lose control by Friday, they will break apart everything my father built. They will sell the rural clinics, the senior housing projects, the old hotels he promised never to tear down. They do not want the company. They want the pieces." Daniel's expression softened, but only slightly. "And why me?" Madeline looked toward Ellie again, then back at him. "Because my father trusted men who kept promises. Everyone else around me keeps accounts." Daniel picked up the check and held it out to her. A man can be poor and still not be for sale. She did not take it immediately. Her expensive coat dripped onto his worn wooden floor. The distance between them felt larger than money and smaller than truth. Finally, she took the check with a quiet breath. Daniel gathered the contract pages and slid them back across the table. "I buried my wife with my wedding ring still on my hand," he said. "My daughter knows that name. She carries it. I do not lend it out because someone with a taller house is running out of time." Madeline lowered her eyes. For the first time since she stepped inside, she looked less like a CEO and more like a woman who had knocked on the wrong door with the wrong offer, only to find the right kind of man behind it. Then from the sofa, a small, sleepy voice whispered, "Daddy, is the rain lady scared?" Ellie sat up slowly beneath the quilt, her hair messy from sleep and one cheek marked with the crease of the sofa pillow. Daniel turned at once, his whole posture changing from guarded to gentle in a single breath. "Go back to sleep, sweetheart," he said softly. Ellie did not move. Her eyes stayed on Madeline, who stood near the kitchen table with a wet coat, a folded check in her hand, and a face that had forgotten how to hide quickly enough from a child. "She looks scared," Ellie whispered. Madeline opened her mouth, then closed it again. In boardrooms, she knew how to answer accusations, investors, lawyers, and men who smiled while trying to take her company apart. But no one had prepared her for a 9-year-old girl asking the truth with sleepy eyes and no agenda. Daniel crossed the room and tucked the quilt around Ellie's shoulders. "Some grown-ups get scared too," he said. "Even rich ones." Ellie asked. Daniel glanced toward Madeline. "Especially when they think money is supposed to make them brave." Madeline looked down. The words were not cruel. That somehow made them harder to hear. Rain pressed against the roof in steady waves, and the wood stove filled the small house with a warmth that made her expensive life feel suddenly distant and cold. Ellie slipped off the sofa, padded across the room in wool socks, and picked up the dry towel Madeline had never used. She held it out with both hands. "You can have this," she said. "Daddy says wet clothes make people sad faster." Madeline stared at the towel as if it were a contract written in a language she had forgotten. Slowly, she took it. "Thank you, Ellie. How do you know my name?" "Your father said it." Ellie nodded, accepting that as enough. "Are you going to take our house?" Madeline's eyes widened. "No, never." "Are you going to make Daddy sad?" Daniel inhaled quietly. Madeline looked at him, then back at the child. The answer mattered more than she expected. "I do not want to." Ellie studied her face with the serious attention only children have when they sense adults are standing near a truth. "Then why did you bring papers?" Daniel almost smiled despite himself. Madeline folded the towel around her shoulders and sat carefully on the edge of the wooden chair, as if the simple furniture deserved more respect than she had first given it. "Because I made the mistake of thinking papers could fix people," she said. Ellie looked confused, but Daniel understood. The room softened. Something in Madeline's voice had changed. Less polished, more human. Daniel walked to the stove, added another piece of wood, and let the fire catch before speaking. "Who is pushing you out?" Madeline swallowed. My cousin Preston. 3 board members. 2 attorneys who worked for my father and now pretend they never heard his promises. What promises? Affordable senior housing in 3 counties. A children's clinic in Burlington. Historic inns he refused to sell to developers. If they remove me Friday, those properties are gone by spring. Ellie hugged the quilt around herself. That sounds mean. It is complicated, Madeline said. Daniel looked back at her. No, it sounds mean. For the first time, Madeline almost laughed, but it broke before it became sound. Her eyes glistened, not from weakness, but from the relief of hearing someone name the thing plainly. Daniel pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. I am still not signing a marriage contract. Madeline nodded quickly. I understand. And I am not letting anyone use my daughter as decoration for a family story that is not real. I would not ask that. You already almost did. The silence after that was clean and necessary. Madeline accepted it without defense. Ellie climbed into Daniel's lap, resting her head against his shoulder while still watching the woman in the chair. Outside, thunder rolled away into the mountains, quieter now. Daniel looked from his daughter to Madeline and saw what pride had hidden at first. Not a cold woman trying to buy a man. A cornered daughter trying to protect the last good pieces of her father's name. I will hear the full truth, he said at last. Madeline lifted her eyes. That is all. Daniel held Ellie closer. For tonight, that is more than you had when you knocked. By midnight, the storm had softened into a steady rain, and the little house seemed to breathe more quietly around them. Ellie had fallen asleep again, this time in Daniel's lap, one small hand resting against the sleeve of his flannel shirt. Madeline sat across from them at the kitchen table with the towel around her shoulders and the leather folder closed between her hands, no longer presenting it like a weapon or a solution, but like evidence of how desperate she had become. Daniel listened as she explained the terms her father had written before his passing, the board meeting scheduled for Friday, the family voting trust, and the strange requirement that had sounded heartless until she finally said it out loud. He wrote that I had to appear before the trustees with a husband who could testify to my character, she said quietly. Not a fiancé, not a business partner, a husband. Daniel looked at the rain-streaked window. Why would your father do that to you? Madeline's answer came slowly. I thought he was punishing me for choosing work over family. But now I think he was trying to force me to bring someone into the room who was not afraid of the room. The fire settled into a low, orange glow. Outside, water dripped from the eaves in patient rhythm. Daniel shifted carefully so Ellie would not wake. And you chose me because I am not afraid of your board? I chose you because years ago, my father stayed in one of your cabins after his heart surgery, Madeline said. He never told anyone. He wrote in his journal that the carpenter who fixed the porch refused extra payment because the work was already done right the first time. Daniel remembered the old man then. William Whitmore had used a simpler name and worn work gloves that had clearly never seen much work. He had asked questions about wood, weather, loss, and raising children. Daniel had never known he was speaking to one of the wealthiest men in Vermont. He was your father? Daniel asked. Madeline nodded. He said you had the rarest kind of honesty, the kind that does not perform for an audience. For a long moment, Daniel said nothing. The compliment did not make him proud. It made him careful. He looked down at Ellie, then back at Madeline. I will not marry you for money. I know. I will not lie to my daughter. I understand. And I will not stand in some marble room while people look at her like she wandered in through the service door. Madeline's expression tightened with shame before she answered. If anyone disrespects her, we leave. Daniel studied her face. No. If anyone disrespects her, I leave. You decide whether you follow. The words landed with quiet weight. Not harsh. Not dramatic. Just a boundary, laid down like a beam in a house that needed to stand through winter. Madeline nodded once. Fair. And there will be no pretending inside this home. Ellie will know we are helping you with a legal problem. Nothing more. Then the trustees will reject it. Maybe. Daniel's voice remained calm. But if your father wanted someone honest beside you, starting with a lie seems like a poor way to honor him. Madeline looked at him as if the room had shifted. For years, everyone around her had treated morality like a luxury item, something discussed after the contracts were safe. Daniel spoke of it as if it were the floor beneath his feet. She lowered her gaze to the folder. I do not know how to win that way. Daniel glanced toward the stove, then toward the sleeping child in his arms. Most people do not. That is why winning costs them so much. The rain tapped gently against the window. Madeline slowly opened the folder again, removed the check, folded it in half, and placed it back inside her coat pocket. Then she slid only the estate documents across the table. "Will you read these?" she asked. Daniel nodded. "I will read them. Will you come with me tomorrow?" Daniel took the pages but did not answer immediately. He looked at Ellie, at the faded family photograph on the mantel, at the roof he still needed to repair before the first hard snow. Then he looked at Madeline Whitmore, no longer as a rich woman trying to buy a name, but as a daughter standing in the rain with the last decent pieces of her father's promise slipping through her hands. "I will come," he said, "but not as your husband." Madeline's breath caught. Daniel held the papers firmly. "I will come as the man your father trusted. If that is not enough for them, then maybe the problem was never your marital status." The next afternoon, Daniel Mercer drove down from the Vermont hills in his old green pickup with Ellie beside him and Madeline Whitmore following in her silver sedan, the roads still damp from the previous night's rain and the mountains washed clean beneath a pale gray sky. By the time they reached the Whitmore estate, the world seemed to change all at once. The gravel road became a long paved drive lined with stone walls and bare maple trees. The small houses gave way to rolling lawns, iron gates, and a mansion of white columns and dark windows standing above the valley like it had been built to judge anyone who approached. Ellie pressed her hand to the truck window. "Daddy, is that a hotel?" Daniel glanced at the house. "No, sweetheart. That is what happens when people build more rooms than they know how to fill." Ellie considered that carefully. "Seems lonely." Daniel looked toward Madeline's car in the mirror and said nothing. At the front steps, two attendants opened the doors before Madeline could reach them. She had changed back into her polished world, wearing a cream coat and a controlled expression, but Daniel could see the tension in her shoulders. Inside, the foyer smelled of lemon polish, old money, and fresh flowers arranged too perfectly to feel alive. Marble floors reflected the chandelier above them. Portraits of Whitmore ancestors stared down from the walls as if measuring the worth of every breath. A man in a charcoal suit stepped forward with a thin smile. Preston Whitmore. Daniel knew him before anyone said the name. Some men introduced themselves with handshakes. Others introduced themselves with the way they looked at your boots. Preston chose the boots. "Madeline," he said smoothly, "I was not aware you were bringing guests from the maintenance entrance." Ellie moved closer to Daniel. Madeline's jaw tightened. "This is Daniel Mercer. And this is his daughter, Ellie." Preston's eyes flicked toward the child, then back to Daniel. "How charming." Daniel did not answer. He simply removed his cap, held it in one hand, and looked directly at him. "Nice house." Preston smiled wider. "It has been in the family for generations." "Then I hope somebody here remembers what family means." The foyer went quiet. Madeline looked at Daniel, surprised by the calm weight of the sentence. Preston's smile thinned. From the drawing room beyond, board members, attorneys, and relatives watched with polite curiosity sharpened by judgment. Daniel entered without shrinking. His jacket was clean but old. His boots were plain but wiped. Ellie held his hand, her eyes wide as she took in the grand staircase and the silver-framed photographs lining the walls. Madeline walked beside them, no longer ahead of them, and that detail did not go unnoticed. In the drawing room, conversations softened as they passed. A woman whispered behind a teacup. An attorney adjusted his glasses. Someone glanced at Daniel's left hand, noticing the wedding ring still there, worn smooth from years of work and grief. Preston gestured toward the fireplace. "So this is the husband?" Madeline opened her mouth, but Daniel spoke first. "No." The room paused. Preston lifted an eyebrow. "No." Daniel stood beside the mantel, steady as a beam in an old house. "I am not her husband. I am the man her father trusted enough to tell the truth." A few people shifted in their seats. Madeline's face went still. Ellie looked up at her father with quiet pride. Preston gave a soft laugh. "That is not what the clause requires." Daniel looked around the room, not impressed, not intimidated, only present. "Then maybe all of you have been reading the clause and missing the man who wrote it." The silence that followed was not loud, but it had weight. For the first time since Daniel walked through the door, the people in that room stopped looking at his jacket and started listening to his voice. The attorney cleared his throat and stepped toward the long walnut table where the estate documents had been arranged in careful stacks. each page marked with colored tabs and signatures from people who had spent years turning family wishes into legal language. Madeline stood near Daniel with her hands folded tightly in front of her, and for the first time in that mansion, she did not look like the most powerful person in the room. She looked like a daughter waiting to hear whether her father had left her a door or a wall. Preston leaned against the fireplace with polished ease, his expression carrying the confidence of a man who believed the outcome had already been purchased by procedure. "Let us not romanticize this," he said. "The clause is clear." Daniel looked at him. "Then read it clearly." A faint ripple moved through the room. The attorney adjusted his glasses, then lifted the document. His voice was careful, professional, but something in it changed as he reached the final section. "The controlling trustee shall appear before the board by the appointed date with a lawful spouse, or with a witness of moral standing accepted by majority trustee vote, who can testify to the trustee's character, domestic responsibility, and capacity to preserve family commitments beyond personal profit." Madeline's head turned sharply. "Read that again." Preston straightened. "That wording was never emphasized." "No," Daniel said quietly. "I imagine it was not." The attorney swallowed and read the sentence again, slower this time. The room changed with each word. Lawful spouse or witness of moral standing. Character. Domestic responsibility. Family commitments beyond personal profit. Madeline pressed one hand lightly against the edge of the table as if the floor had shifted beneath her. All those months, she had believed her father had cornered her into marriage. All those sleepless nights, all those humiliating meetings, all that fear of being judged incomplete because she stood alone. But her father had not demanded a husband. He had demanded proof that she could recognize a person of character when power was no longer enough. Ellie tugged Daniel's sleeve and whispered, "Daddy, does that mean you can help without marrying her?" Daniel looked down at her. "That is what honest words usually do, sweetheart. They make room for the truth." Madeline's eyes filled, but she kept her chin steady. Across the room, several board members exchanged uncomfortable looks. A woman with silver hair leaned forward and asked, "Mr. Mercer, did William Whitmore know you personally?" Daniel nodded. "He stayed at my cabins one winter under the name Bill Moore. He said he needed quiet. I gave him quiet." "And what did you know of him?" Preston interrupted. Daniel turned toward him, calm and unhurried. "I knew he tipped badly until I told him to stop trying to impress people. I knew he asked too many questions about my daughter because he missed his own. I knew he could not drive a nail straight, but would keep trying until his hands hurt. And I knew he worried that this house had taught his family how to inherit things without learning how to honor them." The room fell still. Even the grandfather clock near the doorway seemed louder than before. Madeline closed her eyes for 1 second, as if hearing her father's voice through Daniel's plain words. Preston's face tightened. "This is sentimental nonsense." Daniel did not raise his voice. "No. Sentiment is pretending a portrait on the wall means family while planning to sell the promises the man made." A trustee near the window lowered his gaze. The attorney looked down at the papers again, suddenly less certain of the victory Preston had promised. Daniel rested one hand on Ellie's shoulder and continued, not to attack, but to testify. "William Whitmore wanted his daughter protected from people who measure legacy by what can be divided. He did not ask her to find a rich man. He asked her to bring someone into this room who would not be impressed by it." Madeline turned toward him, and the cold space between her world and his seemed smaller than it had been the day before. For the first time, she understood the clause was not a trap. It was her father's final act of grace. And Daniel Mercer, standing in work boots on a marble floor, was the answer her money could never have bought. By early evening, the trustees had moved from the drawing room into the formal dining room, where a long table gleamed beneath candlelight, and silverware rested in perfect rows beside porcelain plates. Outside the tall windows, the Vermont sky had turned deep blue, and the last rainwater from the storm clung to the bare maple branches like glass beads. Madeline sat at one end of the table, still trying to understand how one sentence in her father's clause had been hidden in plain sight for so long. Daniel sat to her right with Ellie beside him, his posture straight, his hands folded quietly in his lap, his wedding ring catching the soft light whenever he moved. The room smelled of roasted vegetables, polished wood, and old money pretending it had never been afraid. Preston lifted his glass and smiled across the table. "Well, this has become quite the country sermon. he said. A carpenter, a child, and a temporary husband who is not even a husband. A few uncomfortable chuckles passed around the table, then faded quickly. Ellie lowered her eyes to her plate. Daniel noticed. So did Madeline. Her hand tightened around her napkin, but before she could speak, Daniel placed his own napkin gently beside his plate and stood. He did not shove the chair back. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood with the kind of calm that made arrogance lose its footing. "Do not call me that in front of my daughter," he said. Preston leaned back. "Call you what?" "Temporary." The words settled over the table like a church bell after the final note. Preston gave a thin smile. "Surely you understand the arrangement." Daniel looked at him steadily. "I understand arrangements. I build houses. Every beam has a purpose. Every wall carries weight. If you put something temporary where something honest belongs, the whole structure eventually tells on you." No one moved. Even the servers near the wall stood still with trays in their hands. Daniel rested one hand lightly on the back of Ellie's chair. "I came here because your uncle once sat on my porch and told me he was afraid his daughter had inherited a kingdom full of people who knew the price of land, but not the cost of loneliness. I came because he trusted me to say what polite people avoid. And I came because a promise does not become less sacred just because rich people put it in legal language." Madeline stared at him, her eyes shining in the candlelight. Preston's jaw tightened, but Daniel continued without anger, and that was what made it impossible to dismiss him. "My wife has been gone 6 years. I still wear this ring because love does not stop being real when the paperwork changes. I raise my daughter in a small house because peace matters more than marble. I work with my hands because honest labor teaches a person not to look down on anyone who keeps going." Ellie reached for his hand. Daniel let her take it. "So if this family wants to test whether Madeline understands responsibility, start there. Watch how she treats the clinic her father promised. Watch how she protects seniors who cannot hire attorneys. Watch whether she can apologize when she is wrong. But do not mistake a missing husband for a missing heart." The dining room fell into a silence so complete that the clock in the hall sounded like footsteps. Madeline slowly rose from her chair. Her voice was softer than anyone expected. "Daniel is right." Preston turned toward her sharply, but she did not look at him. She looked at Ellie first, then Daniel. "I asked him to become a solution because I was afraid. I brought money to his home because I forgot that dignity cannot be purchased. And I almost let all of you convince me that my father wanted me married more than he wanted me honest." A trustee near the end of the table lowered her gaze. The attorney closed his folder without a word. Preston opened his mouth, but no sound came quickly enough. Madeline faced the room. "If I keep this company, I will keep it by honoring what my father built, not by pretending to be someone I am not." Daniel remained standing beside Ellie, quiet again, as if the words had cost him nothing because truth rarely needs decoration. Outside, the wind moved softly through the wet trees. Inside, the people who had judged him by his boots finally understood why William Whitmore had trusted him with the one testimony money could never buy. The vote did not happen immediately because truth had a way of slowing powerful people down when they had built their plans on speed. After dinner, the trustees returned to the drawing room, where the fire had burned low and the tall windows reflected their faces back at them like a quiet jury. Madeline Whitmore stood near her father's portrait, no longer trying to appear untouchable, no longer hiding behind the perfect posture and polished voice that had carried her through hostile meetings for years. Daniel Mercer remained near the doorway with Ellie close at his side, ready to leave if the room forgot its manners again. Preston paced beside the fireplace, his confidence thinning with every whispered conversation among the board members. "This is emotional manipulation," he said at last. "We are discussing a corporation, not a bedtime story." Daniel looked at him calmly. "A corporation that owns clinics, homes, hotels, and promises. Those are not bedtime stories. Those are people's lives." Madeline turned toward the trustees before Preston could respond. "I owe this room an apology," she said. The words surprised them more than anger would have. She looked first at Daniel, then at Ellie, and her voice stayed steady. "I came to his house last night with a check and a contract because I was afraid. I thought money could solve what courage should have faced. I treated a good man like an emergency tool instead of a person, and I brought my fear close to his daughter without understanding what that could cost." Ellie leaned gently against Daniel's side. Daniel did not speak. He simply listened, and that silence gave Madeline the courage to continue. My father did not leave me a marriage requirement. He left me a character test, not just for whoever stood beside me, but for me. He wanted to know whether I could tell the difference between loyalty and convenience, between family and inheritance, between a man who wants something from me and a man who will tell me the truth when it gains him nothing. The room was still. The candlelight trembled across the silver frames on the walls. Somewhere outside, wind moved through wet branches, soft as breath. A silver-haired trustee folded her hands. And what do you intend to do if control remains with you? Madeline lifted her chin, but there was no arrogance in it now. I will keep the Burlington Clinic open. I will protect the senior housing contracts. I will freeze all asset sales connected to my father's community promises until they are reviewed publicly. And I will remove any executive, cousin, or advisor who treats legacy like scrap wood. Preston's face hardened. You would divide the family over this? Madeline looked at him with quiet sadness. No, Preston. You already did that when you tried to sell what he asked us to protect. A low murmur passed through the trustees. The attorney looked down at the clause again, then at Daniel. Mr. Mercer, will you formally testify that Ms. Whitmore has shown capacity to preserve family commitments beyond personal profit? Daniel glanced at Madeline. He did not make her wait long. Yes. Her breath caught, but he continued. Not because she came to my door perfect. She did not. Not because she understood dignity right away. She did not. But because when the truth stood in front of her, she stopped defending her pride and started protecting her father's promise. That matters. Madeline's eyes glistened. Ellie reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small folded paper she had drawn on during dinner. She walked to Madeline and held it up. It showed 3 stick figures standing under an umbrella in the rain. This is for you, Ellie said. So you remember you do not have to be scared alone. Madeline took the drawing with both hands, as if it were worth more than the mansion around her. For a moment, the CEO, the trustees, the attorneys, and the polished room all faded behind one child's simple grace. Then the silver-haired trustee stood. I vote to accept the witness. One by one, hands rose around the room. Not all with warmth. Not all with joy. But enough. Preston looked away. The attorney marked the decision. Madeline closed her eyes, and the tears she had held back finally slipped free, not from defeat, but from release. Daniel picked up Ellie's coat and moved toward the door. Madeline turned quickly. Daniel. He stopped. She swallowed. Thank you. He gave her the smallest nod. Keep the promises. That is thanks enough. And as he stepped out into the cold Vermont night with Ellie's hand in his, Madeline stood beneath her father's portrait holding a child's drawing, finally understanding that the man she had asked to become a husband had instead become the witness who taught her how to become herself. Friday morning came quietly, not with thunder, not with urgency, but with a thin silver rain drifting over the Vermont hills like the world had decided to speak softer. Daniel Mercer was outside his little wooden house before sunrise, repairing the last loose board on the porch while Ellie sat on the steps in her yellow raincoat, eating toast from a paper towel and watching the mist move through the trees. The old green pickup rested in the driveway, still carrying mud from the Whitmore estate, and beside the front door, the folded drawing Ellie had made was tucked under a small magnet, a reminder that even a child could sometimes see more clearly than a room full of trustees. Daniel drove a final nail into place and stepped back to check the board. Looks good, Ellie said. You sound like the inspector. I am stricter than the inspector. Daniel smiled, but his eyes moved toward the road when he heard a car approaching. A silver sedan rolled slowly up the gravel drive, not followed by security, not polished for display, not rushing like power had somewhere better to be. Madeline Whitmore stepped out beneath a small navy umbrella, wearing dark jeans, a simple wool coat, and shoes that were already losing their battle with the mud. In one hand, she carried a white bakery box tied with string. In the other, she held Ellie's drawing carefully inside a clear folder to protect it from the rain. Ellie stood. You came back. Madeline smiled, nervous in a way Daniel had never seen before. I promised myself I would return this in person after it helped me get through the board meeting. Ellie looked at the folder proudly. Did they stop being mean? Madeline glanced at Daniel. Some did. Some will need practice. Daniel set the hammer on the porch rail. And the company? The trustees accepted the witness. The clinic stays open. The senior housing contracts are protected. Preston resigned from the asset committee this morning. She said the words with relief, but not triumph. That mattered. The old Madeline would have announced victory like a headline. This one seemed more grateful for the chance to do right than for the power to win. She looked at Daniel and took a careful breath. I also came to apologize again, without an audience this time. Daniel leaned against the porch post. You already did. Not enough. Rain tapped gently on the umbrella. Behind him, the wood stove smoke curled from the chimney, carrying the smell of pine into the wet morning air. Madeline looked toward the house, then back at him. I came here looking for a husband because I was afraid of standing alone. But you were right. I did not need a man to save my name. I needed someone honest enough to help me remember what my name was supposed to mean. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Ellie took the bakery box from Madeline and peeked inside. Cinnamon rolls, she whispered, as if announcing treasure. Madeline laughed softly. I was told children trust people faster when pastries are involved. That is mostly true, Ellie said. Daniel shook his head, but the corner of his mouth lifted. Madeline closed the umbrella and stepped under the edge of the porch, leaving the rain behind her, but not demanding to come farther. I am not asking for a contract, she said. I am not asking for a performance. I am not asking you to fix my life. Her voice softened. I am asking whether I might come inside for coffee, as myself. Daniel looked at her muddy shoes, the bakery box in Ellie's arms, the clear folder protecting a child's drawing, and the woman who had arrived days ago wrapped in pride and panic, but now stood at his door with humility in both hands. He thought of his late wife, of the ring still on his finger, of the promises that had shaped him and the second chances that did not erase grief, but sometimes made room beside it. Ellie looked up at him. Daddy, the rain lady brought breakfast. The simplicity of it broke the last bit of distance. Daniel opened the door. Then she should not stand outside until it gets cold. Madeline's eyes glistened, and this time she did not hide it. She stepped into the warm little house not as a CEO, not as a desperate daughter, not as a woman searching for a husband by Friday, but as a person finally welcomed without a price. The rain continued falling softly over the Vermont hills, but inside, coffee began to brew, cinnamon warmed the air, and three lives sat down at one small kitchen table where dignity, grace, and quiet respect had made something stronger than any contract.